This meeting is being held in compliance with the Brown Act. SCAG offices are open for members of the public to attend and participate in person. Instructions for providing public comment have been provided in advance and are also included in the agenda packet. If a member of this body is attending remotely but is not at a location specified on the agenda, they may observe and comment as a member of the public, but may not participate in any member discussion or voting of this body. For all members participating remotely, please ensure your microphone is muted when not in use. Please state your name during deliberations and whether making a motion or offering a second. Any voting member or member of the public calling into this meeting by telephone can press *6 to mute and unmute. All telephone participants should identify themselves prior to speaking. SCAG encourages all members of the public to participate in its meetings. We are committed to holding meetings accessible to people with disabilities. For members of the public requiring ADA accommodation, please call 213-630-1410. SCAG offers free interpretation services for members of the public needing information in another language. Please call 213-236-1895. The meeting will now begin.
Madam Clerk, do we have quorum? Okay. All right. With that, then I will call this meeting of our Energy and Environment Committee to order for Thursday, March 6th, 2025. Welcome everyone who is here in person and online. As a reminder, if a member of this body is attending remotely but is not at a location specified on the agenda, they may observe and comment as a member of the public, but may not participate in any member discussion or voting of this body. With that, Vice Chair Meister, would you please lead us in the flag salute?
Absolutely. Everyone, please stand. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right. That brings us to a general public comment. At this time, members of the public may comment on any item that is not on the agenda, but is within the subject matter jurisdiction of SCAG. Staff, have we received any public comments for this meeting?
No public comments.
And is there anyone who wishes to give comment now?
I see no raised hands.
Okay. All right. With that, do we have any items that we need to reorganize today? I mean, we don't have that many items on here, so I'm guessing not. All right, we will move then to the consent calendar. Do we have any members of the public who wish to speak on this item?
I see no raised hands.
Let's see. So if no one's wishing to speak on this item, I would take a motion for approval of the consent calendar. All right. Motion Ramos, second Dennison. Any discussion? Seeing none. We have people online, so we need to do a roll call vote. Yes?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll proceed with roll call. Anna Beltran.
Present.
Okay, thank you. That was for the consent calendar. Was that a yes?
Yes.
Thank you. Art Bishop,
Yes.
Margaret Clark, Robert Copeland, Jenny Crosswhite,
Yes.
Ned Davis,
Davis, yes.
Rick Dennison, Jesus Escobar,
Abstain.
Carmen Hernandez,
Yes.
Sherry Horn,
Horn, I.
Brian Joes,
Yes.
Joe Kalmick,
Yes.
Stephen Leash, Elaine Litzer,
Yes.
Vianney Lopez. Yes. Thank you. Lauren Meister. Yes. Yasmin Imani McMorrin. Yes. Thank you. Daniel Ramos,
Ramos, yes.
Jeanette Sanchez Palacios,
Yes.
Suli Saro, Patty Senecal, Tamala Takahashi,
Yes.
Connor Trout, Stephanie Bergen.
Yes.
Thank you. Madam Chair, the motion for consent calendar passes with 18 votes yes, 1 abstention and 0 no's.
Thank you very much. So that brings us to our informational item of the day. We're going to have a tight schedule, and then I'll get to public comment. We are going to have a tight schedule on this. So we're going to have 3 speakers. There's going to be 10 minutes of Q&A after each speaker, and that will take about our whole 75 minutes. So if there's any time at the end, we can circle it back around to comments from any of the previous speakers, but we'll try to keep our comments and questions as succinct as possible so as many people who have questions can ask them. So do we have any public comment for this item?
I see no raised hands.
All right. With that, then I will call on Ryan Wolf, Manager of Sustainable and Resilient Development with SCAG, to introduce our presenters.
Good morning, everyone. Nice to have you all here today. Hope everyone's having a great month so far. We have a good panel for you here today. This is on climate resilience districts. We had been planning this for quite some time. However, with the recent events in January, this takes on, additional relevance because there's a great need for local resources to help recovery in instances where we have disasters, as well as to help areas throughout our region essentially make themselves more resilient to disasters, the impacts of climate change, and related issues. So we're gonna have 3 speakers for you today. The first is going to be Joseph Diegues from Cosmont Companies. Cosmont does a lot of work in tax increment financing and is an expert in this area. He'll go ahead and go first. Followed by that, we have Tanya Narath, who is the Chief Deputy Executive Director of the Sonoma County Transportation Authority, which is also the Regional Climate Protection Authority. And they are also the first climate resilience district in the state. So they give us a background on their experience. And then finally, we have Nuan Taraki, who is from California Forward, who's been doing a lot of work on climate resilience districts and their role in, increasing resilience and also making sure that we have an opportunity to make sure our communities are affordable and resilient and can be insured moving forward. So with that, I'm going to invite up Joe, who's here in person. Tanya is going to be remote, and then followed by that, we'll have Nuan Tara, who's also joined us in person this morning.
Good morning. Thank you. Thanks, Ryan, for the intro. I'm Joe Dieguez from Cosmont. For those who we've not had a pleasure to work together with, Cosmont is real estate, economic development, public finance advisory. Most of our clients are cities and counties here in California. We do serve some private sector entities, nonprofits, some Fortune 500 companies. A lot of my practice group within the firm is infrastructure, and increasingly so climate resilience. How do you pay for it? That's a lot of my focus. I am joined today by our CEO, Larry Cosmont. And as you can probably tell from the subject today, a lot more of what we're working on, and even more exponentially so in just the past couple months, is just the climate resilience field within infrastructure. When our clients come to us, it's how do we prevent either becoming the next Palisades or Eaton, or if it were to happen, because some of these things are not avoidable, how do we set ourselves up to be resilient and recover faster after the fact, both economically, environmentally, and otherwise? So there's a large world of tools available, whether it's grants, general fund financings, impact fees. We think all of the tools out there have pros and cons, whether it's general fund financings that, yeah, you can get a great interest rate, but you're going out to potentially a citywide vote, your general fund credits on the line, to things like impact fees, which are great because they come from the private sector, but they are one time. And if you push your fee program levels too high, then you're actually stifling private sector investment. So we find that these can be quite complementary, and they need to be to work well. A lot of the focus we're talking about today is this bubble in the top center, tax increment financing, as Ryan mentioned. And as folks may be familiar, we often find it's worth at least a quick review. Tax increment financing is not a new tax. That's the first thing I have to say, and I'll probably say it multiple times. Tax increment financing is what was around up until 2012. It was around for 75 years in the old redevelopment agencies within California. And it's the idea that you draw some boundary within your city or county. And as value grows from new private sector investment or significant rehab or just turnover upon sale, you have the ability as a local agency to say, some portion of my future property tax from within this boundary, I'm going to earmark it. I'm going to put it aside like a retirement account in a special fund. And the biggest bang for your buck, if you're a city, is if for doing that, you're able to get a match from another entity. So if you're a city, you can be recruiting a match from a county, almost like an employer matching a retirement account allocation to an employee. The same concept applies. It's one of the best way agencies can work together. There are several flavors of tax increment out there since 2014, once the first tool started getting introduced. The first one was the Enhanced Infrastructure Financing District in the top left here. And almost every legislative session since 2014, we've seen more and more of these get introduced, and the tools themselves have evolved. So these days, we're at about 31 of these fully formed across the state. Most of them are these EIFDs, the Enhanced Infrastructure Financing Districts. The newest on the block, the one I'm going to talk about most today, that Tanya and Nuantara will also talk about, is the Climate Resilience District, the CRD, third in the top row. It is technically, by definition, a form of enhanced infrastructure financing district, but some focus, we'll say. And these past few years, especially the past few months, this is the topic du jour. This is where we're spending, between Larry and myself, a lot of our time talking to our city and county clients on how to use these tools. So just some fundamentals on the tools. These apply to both the enhanced infrastructure financing districts and the climate resilience districts. They're long-term in nature. We're talking 45 plus year district lifetimes. They can be shorter, but they are authorized up to that duration. They are, these days, generally stood up from the ground up between 12 and 18 months to have them fully formed. Governance is important, a new entity that gets set up, and it essentially reflects the folks who are contributing dollars. If you've got a city and county partnership or a city and fire district partnership, that public financing authority, the governing board for the entity, has representation from the elected bodies of each of those entities. There's a business plan in place to guide the work called an infrastructure financing plan, and that's important. There's got to be some sense of what are you going to pay for? How much money? What is the return on investment for me as a city or a county or a fire district for doing these things? What's the return on investment for the community in terms of jobs, housing, just resolving deficient infrastructure, climate resilience, all of that is baked into this business plan. Importantly, for approving these things, there's no vote. It's not going out to a vote of landowners or residents because we're not adding a new tax. I'll repeat that point. But there is a series of public meetings and hearings that require you to be quite transparent about all those things. What are you going to pay for, fiscal impacts, all of those things. And at the last public hearing, while there's no requirement to vote, there's an opportunity to protest for the landowners and residents within the boundary. That's the closest we get to a vote with these things. The boundaries don't have to be contiguous. So in a lot of our work, we kind of see some almost checkerboard or Swiss cheese type boundaries where we're being quite selective about the areas that are included. And a lot of that is driven by where can the investment be unlocked? If we put flood control, armoring, or sea level rise protection, what are the properties that can now be unlocked with new private sector investment? And that is a lot of how we draw these boundaries, areas for potential growth. The climate resilience district I mentioned are just a form of the enhanced infrastructure financing district. So CRDs have some unique features. They do emphasize certain types of improvements, climate resilience infrastructure improvements as you might exist. There are examples listed like projects that address sea level rise, flood control, wildfire prevention, extreme heat, drought. So sort of the things that you would expect, but it's a list, very importantly, that starts with the words including but not limited to. So we're finding more and more flexibility as we work with our legal counsel partners, and it varies so highly by jurisdiction. Very importantly, unique to the CRD, why we think we're seeing some more momentum for these CRDs, even compared to the quite popular EIFDs, that they can fund operations in addition to just capital improvements and maintenance. So I'll repeat it, both the EIFDs and the CRDs can fund capital improvements and maintenance of improvements, but only these climate resilience districts can fund operations, so things like staff time or hiring additional staff if the case may be. So we're finding that's getting the attention of some agencies who are looking at this form of financing in general. I want to be, for sake of your time, I want to be efficient with my time here. I'm going to skip this slide and I want to talk about why we're seeing agencies do these things. We know, because a lot of our clients are finance directors, county CFOs, that if you're going to tie up any piece of your future property tax that would otherwise be unrestricted general fund reason, there better be a good reason. And so when we're forming these, even before the analysis is required, we're doing this general fund net fiscal impact analysis. If I, as a city or a county, I'm going to tie up some piece of my future property tax, what am I getting for it? What's the growth that I'm going to unlock that wouldn't happen otherwise or happen as fast? And so we project the impacts from that investment over time. And it's not only revenues. With new development, there are expenditures for providing public safety, road maintenance, all these other things. And so these analyses look sort of bottom line, net, what am I getting for doing this? And if I don't come out ahead, or I look worse for doing it, but if I don't do it, we'd say, obviously don't do it. But we're finding, especially in the realm of climate resilience, when we're talking about unlocking properties in a floodplain or helping residential even be capable of getting insurance because they have some protection from wildfire, that we are truly unlocking growth that would otherwise not happen, driving a significant but for positive ROI scenario. Second, the more nuanced point we find that communities are getting interested in this space is setting yourself up to bring in other money. We're seeing, especially at the state level, particularly with Prop 4 passing $10 million for climate resilience infrastructure, there's going to be competition for that money. And the more innovative that the local agencies can be to compete for those dollars sets you up for success. And we're already seeing draft legislation to do things like prioritize Prop 4 dollars for local agencies that are doing this sort of innovative long-term commitment of dollars with these districts. The trend, we certainly were seeing it at both the state and federal level. We'd say the federal funding is becoming a little bit more uncertain, but we have certainly lots of things going at the state level, particularly Prop 4. It was first the State Department of Housing and Community Development, HCD, that were the first ones to mention things like EIFDs explicitly in their scoring, their rubric for scoring applications for the pro-housing incentives. and we know that trend is going to continue. So after state HCD, we were seeing more emphasis from other state agencies, and we know that will continue. Prop 68 for parks and open space, Prop 1 for water, Caltrans for roadway funding. And those are aside from the catalytic impacts on the private sector side. I mentioned 31 of these fully formed across the state. Majority of these are these enhanced infrastructure financing districts, or EIFDs. Cities doing this alone, cities and counties partnering, counties doing them alone in unincorporated jurisdiction. Some of these are sort of unincorporated county jurisdictions where it's just basic water, sewer, and roads needed to unlock residential development. A lot of our work in urban areas is about transit, first mile, last mile connectivity, helping transit-oriented development pencil. And increasingly so, these marked with the CRD, a lot more of it is just about how do we plan for the next flood, sea level rise, the next wildfire, just climate resilience. And we're seeing that up and down the state, some examples in Santa Cruz, Calipatria, and Imperial County. And now a recent motion introduced by Councilmember Park in the city of LA for a climate resilience district in the city of Los Angeles. I couldn't resist putting this in here. SCAG has played a large role in these sorts of districts over time. It started even before REAP 1.0 with funding pilot projects. I've listed them here. I won't go into them. REAP 2.0 now is as funding set aside for tax increment projects. So SCAG has certainly played a large role in helping local agencies not only study these things, but actually stand them up and implement them, including the first city-county partnership in the city of Placentia, County of Orange. So I just want to touch on one case study because you'll hear from Tanya about Sonoma County. But one interesting case study I wanted to highlight was City of Inglewood here in Los Angeles County, where it's a transportation focus. City of Inglewood liked the CRD, particularly because of that operations component. When you're talking about transportation infrastructure, these tend to have higher operations, not just the CapEx, not just the maintenance, but it's also the operations. So that was interesting. Another reason I mention it is because it's a city-county partnership, and it takes advantage of a project area feature where the County of Los Angeles was only interested in partnering with the city in certain parcels within the larger boundary. And there are features within this tool to allow that. If you're a city talking to a county, but the county has only interest in certain area geographically, there's ability to accommodate that. The last reason I bring up this example is it's truly a sort of a public-private transaction. It was a city and county working together. The primary purpose for this district is not to issue bonds at all, but to serve as a backstop, a reserve for a federal grant funding source, bringing together city, county, federal funding, and all of it to catalyze private sector investment, which really drives that assessed value growth, which is what's captured by these things. So lots of layers, and we like that example that this one continues to evolve. For sake of time, I don't want to get lost on this slide. I just want to illustrate the point that there's a roadmap to form these things. There are a series of steps. Core to this plan is this drafting of a business plan, the so-called infrastructure financing plan. And there is a public meeting and hearing process built around that, where you're forced to be quite transparent about what you're going to do. You're presenting it multiple times at meetings and hearings that are publicly noticed by mail, newspaper, website, and then culminating in a majority protest opportunity. So this is the 12 to 18 months process that I alluded to earlier. And it's actually been consolidated a little bit with a recent piece of legislation that eliminated one of the hearings and just streamlined some of the notices. That bill that I just mentioned is the Senate Bill 1140, which was adopted last year. It just tightened a process that was at least 30 to 60 days longer before last year, and it's just been streamlined a little bit after some advocacy by industry groups, Cosmont as the main practitioner in the field, and others, just because we were finding city and county staff were spending a lot of money just on paper that nobody was reading, and wasn't really facilitating a productive dialogue. Other bill has been passed, SB 761, just last year. This is for these financing districts that are focused on transportation improvements as a means to address greenhouse gas reduction, extends the timeline of these districts beyond 45 years for those who are interested. AB 1819 introduced, really emphasized more wildfire prevention, the ability of these districts almost foreseeing the calamities in Palisades and Eaton, funding for vegetation clearance, fire breaks, undergrounding utilities, other things to prevent wildfire. And then a big one that we continue to harp on is Prop 4 passing by the voters statewide, $10 billion for climate projects. We've heard more and more emphasis on wildfire prevention, also a lot about water, mobility, other types of improvements, and we know that's going to be very competitive money. We had an updated set of slides that didn't make it in. It could be mailed out later or just reach out and we'll share it. A new one that Larry and I really like. It's just in draft right now, SB 74. This is one where the state is seeking to stand up a matching funding source for cities and counties that do these types of district. They're calling it infrastructure gap funding, SB 74. And the idea is they would allocate up to 20% of projects funding gap for communities that are going after especially climate resilience type infrastructure projects. So we hope it goes through. It's just in draft. We're tracking it closely. There's another one, I believe SB 569. 569. That's a modification of the EIFD tool. Bottom line, we see these tools continue to be more flexible. They're evolving over time, and we think that's going to keep happening with each legislative session. So my last slide is a little bit just on lessons learned. We like to start a lot on what needs to be funded. If it's a sea level rise focused project, it tells, a city, I need to be talking to my county as a potential partner. Maybe a flood control district could also be a water district as a potential partner. If it's wildfire, we'll see more city and fire district partnerships like Rancho Cucamonga did with Rancho Fire. So we think focusing on what needs to be funded, and oftentimes it's a mixed bag of things, and that informs still who you're talking to, and work backwards. How large does your district then need to be? How much of your future increment are you tying up? How long does it need to go for? All those sorts of things. Second bullet, to that same point, including those potential partners early. We'll say if you're a city, don't approach a county or a fire district with a fully baked cake. Rather, get their input earlier on into this business plan so that there's time to incorporate that feedback, so that everyone's rowing in the same direction. It really does require that third bullet point. We're finding that if there's going to be, especially these partnerships, there needs to be a champion at every level, certainly on staff, but especially so on the elected official level. And so for city trying to seek partnership with the county, a lot of it is meeting with local supervisor and their staff, trying to make sure that the plan is in alignment with the supervisor's vision for that district. The fourth bullet on defensively analyzing return on investment. We can't walk into a room and say, if you don't do this, nothing is going to happen in this boundary. It's not a defensible position. It often takes a more realistic look. Maybe it's just going faster. Maybe the density without the infrastructure would be 20 units per acre, but with the water, sewer, and power infrastructure, it can be 40 units per acre if that's what you want. And defensively analyze that incremental return on investment. The realistic but-for test, right along those same lines. What happens with or without the district? Planning is an important piece, second to last bullet point, both in terms of practice and just in terms of assumption. In practice, if there are general plan updates going along or specific plan updates, or even just community plans, it's an opportunity for stakeholder engagement that you can be layering on, okay, here's all the stuff we want to do. Here's how we're going to pay for it. CRD is a component among these other things so that it's not a surprise later when the concept of these tools comes up. And then practically speaking, when we're forecasting growth, it's got to be consistent with what the specific plan allows, obviously in terms of density, FAR, building heights, all those sorts of things. And the last piece, probably obvious, but I'll mention again, it's the complementary funding. We're always telling our city and county clients in particular, definitely go after other people's money, always makes sense. But to make yourself more competitive to do so, look at what you can do locally, whether it's these financing districts or policies that set you up to be a safer bet for that grant source provider, to be more attractive compared to other applications. So that's it. Would love to hear any questions or just any feedback. Thank you.
All right, thank you for the presentation. So we'll take a few questions. The first one I saw here was Member Saro.
Yes. Hello, I'm Suli Saro, council member in Long Beach. Thanks for your presentation. I'm curious with the EIFD, it's relatively new mechanism for revenue generation. And you did share a case study of how it gets formed, but I'm curious about any case study yet. I think maybe the first one formed was West Sacramento. What the actual outcome is of the tax increment generated from the district, just to give us a sense on how much is generated.
You got it. So they're also varied. So West Sacramento was one of the first movers in 2017, 2018. So just on an annual basis now, they're on the high end. They're probably $4 million a year, just an increment. They're not even issuing bonds yet. They may, but they haven't yet. And they haven't had to, just with that ongoing, what we call the pay-as-you-go or pay-go revenue. Their main focus so far has been utilities and roadway. We call it just nuts and bolts, road, water, sewer. So they've been able to do a lot with it. In my next breath, I have to say it won't apply to everyone. They get like 50 cents per dollar of property tax, the way their breakdown is set up. So I wouldn't want to set expectations there. Other end of the spectrum, city of Laverne, closer here in Los Angeles County, much smaller, about 110 acres in size, but it's a city-county partnership. Started small. 2022, we helped them issue, privately place their first debt issuance, and it was $4 million for streetscape improvements at E and 2nd Street. The idea being it's a TOD environment, just beautification, lighting, landscaping, curb bulb outs, just kind of core stuff to make the area more enticing for infill improvements and transit-oriented development. Placentia, City of Orange County, City of Placentia, County of Orange. This year, we'll likely see, well, maybe see, potentially a $10 million issuance. That's the city-county partnership. Definitely a TOD, transit-oriented development focus around a future Metrolink station. Streetscape master plan is the core of that. Similar themes. First, it's kind of sewer to lay the foundation. Sewer capacity was big there. And beyond that, streetscape, again, lighting, wayfinding, signage, landscaping, sidewalk improvements. That one was formed in 2017, but the county actually didn't join until 2020, which is interesting. But they've been able to get. Oh, I'm sorry. That was Laverne. Placentia was formed in 2019. So that one now is about 6 years in the making. First years, honestly, tend to be quiet. Increment is just building up. That's the time when we're telling agencies, use this thing as a marketing tool. Go after those grants, emphasizing this long-term commitment you've made. Find a private sector partner that may be willing to advance infrastructure or advance funding for infrastructure, perhaps beyond their fair share. This is a great reimbursement mechanism to the private sector. So we're looking at that in like Carson, for example, in LA County.
Okay. Member Escobar?
Thank you. Thank you. Just a shout out to Cosmont, Larry, Dan the Man. I worked with them for quite a bit, both at the City of Calexico as well as the County of Imperial. So just a very brief shout out to the team. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have any raised hands online?
We do. We have one. Tamala Takahashi.
Okay.
Hi, good morning. Tamala Takahashi, Vice Mayor Burbank. Thank you for this presentation. This is an exciting opportunity for kind of funding for infrastructure and other kinds of climate projects. I have a question for you about determining the viability of whether this kind of funding is the right kind of funding for our city. So how much, in your experience, based on the cities you've worked with, how much investment, both staff time and city funding itself, goes into determining at the get-go whether it's even a viable option for the projects we're looking at? So basically pre-investment of the city before we actually see a return. How much do you expect a city to give in before in the early stages?
Thank you for the question, Vice Mayor. So it's ranged for the smaller cities. They've been fully funded between staff time, including Cosmont's time, for our work, for legal counsel work, for a licensed surveyor to prepare a map and legal description around like the $100,000 mark to fully stand these up. For the larger ones, we worked on or are working on in cities like Los Angeles, Long Beach, Oakland, it could be $300,000. For those that are wanting to spend additional dollars just on community engagement beyond what the law requires, sometimes there's additional budget there. So that's kind of the dollars. The time, it depends. It's hard for me to say this in an unbiased way. With a consultant involved who sort of has done it many times, they're sort of leading the charge, easing the burden on staff time, a practice like we do. We draft staff reports, resolutions for city attorney review, things like that. So it's typically about review, putting it in the pipeline, of course, for staff reports before public meetings. It is city clerk time, to be fair. I mentioned newspaper notices, mailing notices, website notices. So while consultant, perhaps like us, would draft the notices. It still takes the time of the staff to distribute those and get those out to the public and get it published in the newspaper. So it has varied. I think recently City of Carson did a reimbursement. And so by the way, all those costs are reimbursable for the revenues of the district, which is an important point. So like when City of Carson recently adopted a reimbursement resolution so that the district revenues, which is the city and county partnership, so it's both city and county dollars, reimbursing city funds. I think it was on the order of like $200,000 between Cosmon time, legal counsel, licensed surveyors, and there was a staff allocation within that amount. 200, maybe it was as high as $250,000. So hopefully that addresses the question.
Yeah, thank you very much.
All right, and then we have a question for Member Clark.
Okay, redevelopment. We lost it. I've known Larry for a long time when you came up with this idea. And my question is there any, how much is going toward housing? Because the state keeps blaming us for homeless, lack of housing. And are they on board? Who has these bills? Or who's pushing them, and are they likely to increase? And because we need money, we can't make the developers develop low-income housing. It can happen. So is this a tool that's working on that?
Yeah, so the legislation, it's a few things. The legislation itself doesn't require that any amount go toward the housing. If you're in Los Angeles County, as an example, the county has a policy that says if the county is going to partner with you as a city, you have to allocate 20% of funding for affordable housing uses as one option to meet an affordable housing emphasis. To your, I think, broader, more strategic question on the state's role in all this, who's kind of pushing it. When we look at the bills that are making the tools better, like SB 1140 with Senator Caballero in the Central Valley, Larry and others are talking to Senator Ben Allen about improvements ongoing. So those are the names that come up when we're talking about making these tools more usable. But still, I would argue, I think Larry would argue, that all of it is still more onus on the local agency, the city and the county, to do these things and tie up their own dollars. That is particularly why we're excited by SB 74, which is, in our opinion, the first time we've seen the state say, this is how we're going to help you do it. This is how we're going to make it worth your while. We're going to match you at some level. Just one time, not ongoing, but still up to 20% of project costs. That's the closest we've gotten. We hope it continues from there. Other than that, we think it's going to be about this other funding, to see the state perhaps put teeth in, the Prop 4 money, something clearly perhaps in the guidelines that says if you're a city or county that does a climate resilience district, you're going to be this much more eligible for the 10 billion that was approved by the voters for wildfire or mobility or water. We hope that's where it goes. I think Senator Allen is one of the folks who's working on that. Hopefully this legislative session.
Was Caballero the 74?
No, I can't remember who SB 74 was. I can get back to you on that.
Well, we can Google it.
Yeah, it's just in draft now.
All right, I will allow Member Sorrow to do one more question. We have just a couple minutes left in this section, and then we'll go to our next presenter.
Hopefully it's not too long, but it's a follow-up from your response around how it took the county 2 years to support Laverne's EIFD. Yes, it's great to see a bill where the state will support, but I think we also need to do a lot of work at the county level because realistically, many cities can't do it without county support. So I'm just wondering what we could do, because there's a lot of cities who just don't have the capacity. They have to come together with other surrounding cities. So what can we do to help better educate the county, right? Departments, whether it's public works or to better support cities in the formation of EIFD, because we're still dealing with housing shortage, also now climate issue.
Yeah. I really appreciate the question. The Laverne example is interesting. It's tough being the first. They were the first. They approached the county in 2016 before the county even had a policy. And any county is going to look at the precedent, right? What precedent gets set? If I say yes to Laverne, what am I saying to the rest of the cities? But today, I actually have to tell you that Los Angeles County is probably the best county to be approached for these sorts of things. They have a policy. They followed it. They're now partners with Laverne, Carson, Palmdale, and Lakewood. And hopefully we'll present it to Long Beach City Council soon on something we're working on with your staff. on a form of this?
Yes, I've been waiting for that for.
Me too,
excited for
yeah. But what can be done? Your question is what can be done? So a lot of it happens with elected officials in our experience. To the extent there's outreach between you and your local supervisor's office, that has gone a tremendous way. County staff, at least in Los Angeles so far, very educated. They have a process in place. They can put the wheels on motion, but it's not going to move forward unless the supervisor is directing the county staff to do that. So a lot of it is the elected official connection and outreach. For other counties or hosts, for folks who may be listening, a lot of it's just education. It's technical stuff. I tried to walk through in 12 minutes or whatever, stuff that can be discussed for hours and still may not sink in because it's so technical. So the advanced education, presentations, meetings, we'll come out and do it if that were ever of interest, to come out and educate folks. But we're finding that it takes both the staff connections and the elected official connections to make these things actually work.
All right, thank you very much. We will move on to our next presenter, who I believe is online. Tanya Narath from the Sonoma County Transportation Authority and the Regional Climate Protection Authority.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. My apologies for not being there in person with you today. I really appreciate this opportunity to give you the story of our CPA and our journey to becoming a climate resilience district. Next slide, please. So in my presentation, I'll give you some brief history for the Regional Climate Protection Authority, talk about the funding challenges that we face and how we are trying to address those through the formation or through being designated as a climate resilience district, and then talk about our next steps or priorities for 2025. Next slide. So we are located in Sonoma County, and the mission of our CPA is to lead a local government coalition to mobilize climate action in Sonoma County. You can see on the slide here, our county is fairly spread out, and we have both urban centers in some of our larger cities like the city of Santa Rosa, as well as along the coast and our more rural areas. So we do have a wide range of climate resilience challenges that we're trying to address in the county. Next slide, please. So the RCPA, our history is that we were formed back in 2009, and we really grew out of a strong history of progressive environmental policy in the county. We have our voters voted to tax ourselves to support an open space district, to acquire public lands and support the preservation of open space. Voters passed a multimodal transportation tax in the early 2000s. We've established urban growth boundaries, and our water agency set an ambitious goal of zero carbon water by 2015. In the mid-2000s, we had a real groundswell of community support and champion for more activity on climate change, more action on climate change. And this really inspired our local elected officials at the time to start looking at ways to better tackle the climate challenge in Sonoma County. And the idea formed around what it would take to create a climate-centered local authority. And the real question there was around governance. Now we have the Sonoma County Transportation Authority, which is really a model in Sonoma County that has a governance structure that has representation from all of our elected officials representing the different cities in Sonoma County, as well as the unincorporated county itself. And so after looking at a couple different governance models, it was determined that leveraging the Sonoma County Transportation Authority governance model was really the best way to proceed. And so that was the kind of formation of the RCPA. And we were officially founded through state legislation that was adopted in 2009. And our focus is really on connecting our local priorities to climate action, securing funding, providing collaboration and coordination across all of our jurisdictions. So you can think of us as kind of the connective tissue that ties all of our climate efforts together. And we are, as far as we know, at least the only agency of our kind in California. And having our board of directors with representation from all of our jurisdictions really gives us a unique ability to address issues across both our urban centers as well as the rural parts of the county. We also work very closely with our partner agencies that are shown on the slide, including the Ag and Open Space, Sonoma Water, et cetera. Next slide, please. So this is a timeline of from our formation through the current day to give you a sense of the types of activities and work that we've done over time. Since we were formed in 2009, we've really focused mostly on countywide planning, securing funding, advocacy for policies that support climate, and some implementation. As you can see on the slide, we've produced several key planning documents, including our first countywide climate action plan back in 2016. As a result, I think in part of the climate emergencies that we faced here in Sonoma County in 2017, we had the wildfires that devastated the county, and then again wildfires in 2019 and 2020. We've had major flooding over this period of time, and all of that kind of again a groundswell of community support for taking stronger action to tackle the climate crisis, and that led to all of our jurisdictions in 2019 and 2020 adopting climate emergency resolutions. And when our board adopted our emergency resolution, they directed staff to develop a new climate strategy, and that led to our 2021 climate mobilization strategy that set a new goal of being carbon neutral by 2030. Now, of course, we have this great strategy, and we did not have the funding to actually implement that. And so that led our board, not only for the RCPA, but also our local jurisdictions that have been developing their own climate action plans, really seeing a big gap in terms of funding for both our climate mitigation as well as the resilience and adaptation efforts that are needed. So our board went through a process in 2022, 2023 of looking at ways that we could bring in more funding for local climate work. And of course, now we're focused very strongly on the climate bond. So next slide, please. So just a brief kind of reiterating what I said earlier about the impacts of climate on Sonoma County. We are seeing them in many different ways. The wildfires that I mentioned beginning in 2017, extensive flooding in the Russian River area. We're preparing ourselves for extreme heat, more drought in our future. And so really the threats are growing, not just in Sonoma County, obviously, but across the state. And so that really raises the bar in terms of the funding that we need to bring in for climate resilience. Next slide. So a little bit about our funding challenges. So on the earlier slide, I shared our very ambitious goal of being carbon neutral by 2030. Unlike on the transportation side, which has the quarter-cent sales tax that voters approved early in the early 2000s, and then recently got reauthorized for another 20 years. So we have that sales tax on the transportation side, which really enables us to leverage both state and hopefully continue leveraging some federal dollars to implement the transportation projects. We don't have that same source of funding on the climate side. So we really are limited in terms of the funding options that we have for county-wide funding. And as I'm sure you all know, grants are highly competitive and uncertain, really hard for us to sustain our core staff on grants alone. So our current funding model, about 77% of our funding for the RCPA and our projects comes from member and partner contributions. So our local jurisdictions and our partner agencies contribute an annual amount to the RCPA to provide us that core funding. Next slide, please. Yeah, if you could go to the next slide, please. So you've already heard a lot about the climate resilience districts from Joe, and I'm really excited to hear that there are other other areas in the state that are looking to form climate resilience districts, because I think there will be power in numbers. But for now, RCPA, we were actually grandfathered in the legislation. And the story behind that is that when our board was looking at different funding opportunities in 2022, we learned about the legislation that was being worked on by Senator Dodd. And as we read the drafts of the bill or the language, we realized that a lot of the language in there was really talking about the work that our CPA is already doing, or the way that we operate in a very collaborative model across the county. And so we said, we're really almost already like a climate resilience district. And even though we have authority in our name, we really don't have authority for very much. And so seeing the climate resilience district as a way to get authority to go after more funding to support our climate goals. And so we felt really strongly that we wanted to see our CPA somehow factored into that legislation. And so we were really pleased when we were included in the legislation as the first CRD. Next slide. So in terms of our funding options, I do need to clarify that although we were grandfathered in as a CRD, and we have authority to pursue many of the funding options that are in the legislation, the one piece that we don't currently have authority to pursue is the tax increment financing tool. And if we wanted to pursue that, we would need to go through the steps that Joe outlined for you earlier to form that district, to have our financing plan. And so far, our board has not expressed interest in pursuing that option. I wouldn't say that it's completely off the table, but at this time, we're not actively pursuing that. Next slide. So in terms of the options that we have explored, we did explore the feasibility of putting a climate revenue measure or a sales tax on the ballot in Sonoma County in 2024. We did some polling in the summer of 2023, which showed us that while there's very strong support for climate action in Sonoma County, our sales tax at the time was already close to 10% across most of the county, and there just wasn't voter appetite for adding another sales tax to support the climate work. So we set that option aside for now. We also in the early stages of the climate bond, we did advocate to include language in the climate bond that would either place a priority, as I think Joe mentioned in his remarks, on CRDs to get some prioritization as the funding is distributed, or even to have some type of set aside in the language for climate resilience districts. And I think it was a hard case for us to make, in part because at the time we were the only CRD, which is why I mentioned, if we can get more CRDs formed across the state, that will give us, I think, more leverage and power to request these types of considerations in future language. And then options that we have not pursued due to potential competition with our local jurisdictions are special taxes such as TOT. Most of our jurisdictions already have these types of taxes, and we don't want to be in competition with them. And then the tax increment financing is the other piece that we're not currently pursuing because we do have local interest in that method as well. And again, don't want to be competing with our local jurisdictions for that funding. Next slide. Oh, next slide, please. And I think this is my last slide, which is our priorities for 2025. So with the state climate bond, we will continue to advocate for CRDs, and as those programs are put together to administer the climate bond proceeds, really advocating for priority for climate resilience districts, and of course for the needs that we see here in Sonoma County for climate resilience projects. And then the other component that we're really focusing on strongly is working with our local jurisdictions on multi-jurisdictional grants. We have seen time after time with both state and federal grants that awards are being made to areas that are really combining efforts and going after larger regional grants versus individual jurisdictions. And so we feel like we have a really good set of relationships with our local jurisdictions and have already set up the collaborative structure that will make that possible. And so we plan to pursue more of those types of grants in the year ahead. And so with that, I will end my slides and am happy to take any questions that you might have.
All right, thank you very much. Do we have any questions for this presenter? I don't see any in the room, but there might be some that come up after we get more information about from the next presenter. Are there any online?
No online.
Okay, so we can always circle back around if you'll still be here after the next presenter.
I will be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So that brings us to our final presenter, Nua Taran Key from California Forward. Welcome.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I'm Nuantara Key, Executive Director of Programs at California Forward, and we are a statewide nonprofit that is working to build a new California economy that is inclusive, resilient, and sustainable. And part of our work and our theory of change on what our economy needs to look like is it needs to be bottom up and really elevating the role of regions and regional approach to economic development. And it also recognizes that we cannot separate climate from our economic agenda, and that really to be able to deliver economic opportunity, we have to be incorporating climate risk and opportunity into the work we do across all elements of our economy. So really thrilled to be here today to talk to you all about some of the work we're doing to stand up a climate resilience district incubator. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be here after the presentations and the fellow panelists here, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about how we see climate resilience districts playing into kind of a larger ecosystem of how to leverage and sustain financing and funding for resilience and risk reduction, and some of the broader economic benefits from that, including around the issues that I think we are all very familiar with around insurance availability and affordability in California and increasingly across the country. So I'm going to kind of step back or bring it up a little bit in terms of kind of making the connection with other opportunities. And we'll just, okay, great. So again, kind of stepping back, I think it's helpful for us to think about, how have we managed climate risk? And when I'm talking about climate risk, it's the physical impacts of a changing climate, increased wildfire, extreme heat, increases in temperature, sea level rise, many things that we've heard about already today. And our approach has been organized around kind of what we see as these three categories. So reducing risk, so doing the work to actively manage, for example, forests and reducing potential intensity of wildfires. It also is potentially moving away from risky shorelines or providing, additional protections and hardening there. But we also have thought about, risk in terms of mitigating that risk. So when we can't actually reduce the risk, the underlying risk in that first category, there are actions we can take to mitigate, like building codes and zoning laws that help mitigate risk to physical assets that are in our communities, incorporating kind of natural cooling features, for example, around extreme heat in design of new buildings. And then the third is kind of managing the risk, because there will always be some element of the risk that exists. And so what are we doing to make sure that we have the right financing and funding available when risks or emergencies happen? And so that's that third category. This is where kind of traditional property insurance-based insurance programs come in, national insurance programs, and other risk transfer programs. So the thing that I think is important as we're starting this conversation here is to recognize that the way we've thought about managing risk across these three different kind of categories or approaches has relied on stable historic data and a stable climate system. And as we are seeing increased severity of extreme events and frequency, how we think about how we manage risk also needs to evolve in that context. I think we're all probably familiar with these or very similar charts, which, just recognizes that, as I was just mentioning, our risk profile is changing. And we are seeing not just increased number and extent of extreme events and disasters, we also are seeing a significant increase in the cumulative cost of billion-dollar disasters. So that's the chart on your right, I believe. Yes, on your right. So I won't belabor that. I think we all understand that impact, and especially here in LA with the wildfires, just really recognizing that. Another component, though, to why we are seeing the increase, especially in the cost of these disasters, also has to do with how and where we grow and develop, and the exposure of that infrastructure and communities as well. And so over, here you can see over 80% of properties built in California between 2020 and 2022 were in high fire risk areas. And when you look back at historic data, and I know this is going back quite a ways, but there's about 28% of properties in the earlier part of last century, about 100 years ago. And, we know that, so this increase in risk and exposure is from climate. It also is from, where and how we are growing. And that is an important piece of this conversation, and really where, when we come to climate resilience districts, an important piece and opportunity there to really be thinking about how we're building and growing in a way that is reducing future risk. Okay. So the other thing that I just wanted to kind of frame out here is the recognition that all sectors hold climate risk, and the relationship across the relationship across that ecosystem varies greatly. So for example, we know insurance companies typically write policies on a 1-year basis. So they are kind of entering into the market and holding that risk for a 1-year period on average, typically. Sorry, I'm having okay. We know that tenants on average will hold risk for about 3 years, is kind of the national average in terms of how long tenants are living in a specific location. So they also hold a piece of that risk across the ecosystem. Next here we have, if I can get it. Okay, property owners. The average length in which people are owning properties is about 3 years in the US. So they hold a piece of the risk over a time period. And then lenders, we think about lenders holding risk for about 20 or 30 years over the life of an average kind of mortgage. But really, in reality, the average is about 8 years because of turnover and sale. So they're holding a piece of that. I think what's really important here for our conversation, and is one of the reasons why we were really interested in supporting and engaging around climate resilience districts, is this recognition that government holds that risk forever. Because government, at the end of the day, is not going to pick up and move. It is not going to be able to relocate like other actors in our economy can, which means governments, you all know better than I do, in the room here today, are responsible for the long-term economic health and of your communities. And you also are interacting with actors who also have a piece of that, but thinking about it and holding that risk in different ways and over different time horizons. So we all also know about kind of our current insurance market instability issues, and that is causing cascading impacts across each one of those kind of levels of actors that I had on that last slide. And, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I think we all recognize, the significant challenges we have here in California, again, also nationally, other communities as well, in terms of the ability to access, insurance and affordable insurance, and then the cascading impacts that has potentially across real estate markets and other aspects of our economy. And that this is a really important piece for us to be thinking about as we're looking at both the benefit, but also the structure of climate resilience districts, which I'll come to in a second. But I then want to point out that one of the things that we are seeing, which is, a challenge that we need to figure out how to move forward on, and we think climate resilience districts are one of, important tools, as we heard earlier today, to move away from this place that we are concerned about, where the efforts to reduce risk are actually just moving more and more of those costs and that kind of cost of risk to the public balance sheet. And we need to be thinking about ways that we're reducing the underlying risk that isn't just moving the costs of those risks over to public balance sheet. So for example, we see here at the bottom of this slide, California's FAIR Plan, which is the state-funded kind of insurer of last resort, has seen its exposure increase from 153 billion to over 460 billion in 2024. while it is very important that we have kind of public backstop to provide insurance market stability, that moving over to the public kind of fair plan doesn't actually do anything to reduce the underlying risk. It's just moving the share that the public is holding of that risk. So our premise here is that the way we are thinking about risk and protecting against climate change has to evolve, because if we keep moving in some of the ways that we have, all we are doing again is kind of transferring the risk to the public, and we are not being able to leverage and limiting the amount of resources we have for actually reducing the underlying risk. So what do? This is where climate resilience districts, among many other tools, come into play. Because in our view, what we need to be doing is leveraging sustained investment to reduce, and this is kind of a typical kind of generic risk curve that you see on the slide here, but to reduce the risk at the top of the curve where we can. So actually reducing our exposure, mitigating the risk, working across those three categories that I started with here today. And then making sure that we have the right financing and funding mechanisms to manage when hazards, natural disasters, events happen, because they will. And that's where, I think there's a really important role for insurance and other financing mechanisms to provide cash, capital, investment, financing for the tails, for those risks that we know are going to happen, but we're just better prepared in terms of having the financing. But we can't just rely on the financing. We do have to be reducing the underlying risk to bring that top of the curve down to a more manageable place. So climate resilience districts, this is where we see them as a promising solution for mitigating community climate risk. In addition to the benefits that were described earlier in Joe's presentation, we also see, when and if designed kind of intentionally on the front end, there is an opportunity to really make sure that those investments are going towards risk reduction, reducing exposure to wildfire or drought and sea level rise or flooding, whatever extreme heat, whatever the risks are in that community's profile. And that is critically important, because as we think about the scale of investment that's needed to manage and mitigate the impacts of climate, we have to be moving away, and this is kind of broader term, across the climate adaptation field. We have to move away from thinking about one-time grant funding as the way that we're going to be able to adapt. We have to kind of mature the field of practice on adaptation and resilience to thinking about having sustained revenues that then can be leveraged for other public or private financing and funding as well. So climate resilience districts, in our view, really provide that kind of, then the pink shape on the left side of the screen, that sustained implementation, funding, and financing. The other, and I won't talk too much about this, we heard about it earlier, but around kind of the value and benefit of bringing in some of the community decision-making. There are also opportunities for unlocking private investment, as we've heard about. And then importantly for us, thinking about how are we leveraging climate resilience districts as a way to help stabilize public budgets and local economies? As we all know, when disasters happen, there's increased expenditures to emergency response and the long-term recovery, but there also are impacts on declined revenue. And so really thinking about how are we stabilizing municipal kind of financing and budgeting through investment in risk reduction. So one of the things that we're looking to do through our incubator is get the right partners to the table on the design of the resilience districts from the front end. One of the things, tying back to the insurance kind of piece of all of this, is we really want to set the table to make sure that insurance companies and modelers, actuaries are at the table in the initial design of resilience districts, because we have seen and continue to see a disconnect between the investments that local governments, regional governments, even, statewide, kind of that community scale investment in risk reduction, those are not consistently getting brought into insurance pricing or underwriting, which means communities are making investments all the time to reduce that risk, and that's not getting transferred through. So we see a real opportunity to bring insurance companies and other kind of capital investors to the table to make sure from the front end, the design of the district is getting transferred into those other economic kind of systems and opportunities. So we're looking to, work with communities who are wanting to set up climate resilience districts and helping to be kind of that connective tissue to bring these other economic actors to the table. We also, in the last point here on this slide, just quick, is in the yellow section here, is also really making sure that those investments, and this was covered earlier when you're talking about kind of the enabling statute that created the resilience districts, is that those investments really are using best available science and information to make sure the investments really are reducing future climate risk. And that is another really critical piece on the front end that needs to be part of the thinking here. I talked a little bit about this kind of in our resilience district incubator. Just as a quick note, this came out of a convening that we held at late last year with our partner, Resilient Cities Catalyst, and it was hosted by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, because they are really seeing, and we all are really seeing, that we need to better connect these different financing and funding structures across public and private to really be managing our risks. And with that, I will stop and say thank you and looking forward to conversation.
All right, thank you very much. Do we have questions for our presenter? Member Dennison.
Presentation. I'm going to kind of roll up basically the whole thing you had here today. One of the things we talked about was, climate resilience designs, insurance, those are the things that we deal with on both ends that affect the consumer directly. And of course, the safety of our communities. And I look at mitigating hazards, and that is really an underlying element also. We're talking about shorelines for the areas in this area. Also, people building their wildland or interface, getting close. Those numbers are changing. And with a threat of individual line areas, a threat of fire and other areas, we have barriers too. They're at the state level. So you have Fish and Wildlife, something that they need to have or field, and then you have CEQA that we work with also alongside. There we go. Also, CEQA, that's something that is considering, and all of these items that we've talked about. When you start to change your environment, to harden it, to protect property, to protect life, and all of that, which is important. And then another thing too at the tail end of it is a CRD, and with its design of a protest vote. Those have been challenged in the past for the same type of safety measures to improve possibly like fire districts and things like that. So I'm just looking at all those pieces. It seems like it's pretty complicated when the simplest would be to allow people to take care of a lot of the environment they can handle at a reasonable investment. But all these are great tools to consider too. So that's my thought, and I guess your thoughts on it too.
Yeah, I think one quick response here is I think, yes, we need to do kind of yes and all of the above, which is individual property owners at kind of the individual parcel level have to be kind of thinking about this and thinking about wildfire, for example, kind of vegetation management, brush clearing, home hardening. But we also know that across kind of at a community or regional scale, there has to be investment in kind of the landscape scale, community scale interventions as well. And that's where I think the value of kind of CRDs being able to bring multi-jurisdictions together to be thinking collaboratively of managing the risks that really are everybody's problem, but nobody's individual responsibility. And that's where I think CRDs and other kind of collaborative financing tools can help bring kind of stakeholders together. Absolutely not discounting the significant challenges that you mentioned in terms of kind of permitting and the regulatory structure as well.
Right.
But I think there's a really important piece of broadly our risk reduction, kind of resilience and adaptation has to be individual and it has to be kind of community multi-jurisdictional scale.
And I think in any area, if I may, any CRD is going to be affected by things that are looking at with Fish and Wildlife, with CEQA, with the Coastal Commission, all of them.
Right.
So you can't escape that unless you're sovereign. So that part is always there. And if we can't visualize the expense and the investment to get through those hurdles, the funding will never be able to be applied directly to the solution.
Right.
It will be consumed prior to the development of it.
Right.
That's what I see. It will be a big thing to overcome. Thank you.
Member Saru.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I wanted to go back to your last slide around the Climate Resilience District Incubator Program. If you could share a little bit more information, is there an RFP that's going to come out for it, or how do you apply to be an applicant in it?
You can come talk to me or send me an email. We don't have like a formal application, but we are in conversation. And one of the reasons why we're so excited to be here is to kind of make connections with local jurisdictions who are interested in this and would be interested in participating and working with us through the process. So not a formal application. I will also note that because we are partnering with Resilient Cities Catalyst, our other organizational partner, we're also looking to build a kind of cohort of partners that are interested in piloting both in California, but also beyond. And there's interesting legislation, somewhat modeled, not exactly, but very similar to California. In Connecticut, there's, similar interest in other states as well, and other jurisdictions. So one of the things that we're looking to build out through the incubator is kind of a learning network across and with other communities and other parts of the country that are grappling with this, that also have kind of interesting tools that we could be learning from as well.
Just a quick follow-up. Is it going to just be the benefits as technical support? Is there any funding that comes with being in the program?
We do not have funding for kind of to support, but one of the things that we would be very interested in is kind of doing some joint fundraising for pilots to move forward. Yeah.
Member Clark.
Thank you. I've been on my council 34 years, and unintended consequences, I might write a book about it, because when I saw this, I want to see what you have to say on the last, employ a multi-hazard approach, and you say preventing solutions that address one threat by exacerbating another. Can you give some examples?
Yeah, so I think broadly across, as we're thinking about kind of climate adaptation and resilience, recognizing that climate impacts do not happen kind of in isolation, right? So communities that are impacted by wildfire, as we all know, are then also susceptible to landslide, kind of mudslide issues in kind of flood after fire, or the interconnection between extreme heat and drought. And so one of the things that we really see as an opportunity for climate resilience districts is to build the capacity and that kind of organizational, institutional capacity to be thinking about the many climate risks that a community is going to experience or is already experience. And I think there's a real value in, while maybe some of the strategic investments are addressing just wildfire risk, for example, that they're not done in isolation, because you don't want to be doing one thing that is at the expense of another issue that you're going to have to deal with down the road. Yeah.
I don't see any other comments in the room. Were there any raised hands online?
No online.
All right, well, I will end with one question, and any of the three of you, and who, unless, do you have?
I do, but I'll wait.
Oh, you can go first, Vice Chair.
Thank you. I didn't realize we were wrapping up so quickly. Okay. So I have a couple of questions, and I'm not sure necessarily who should answer, but and I know this might be a really silly question, but are CRDs limited to just jurisdictions, or can applicants be like a formalized long-term recovery group? Because as you know, we're going to be having long-term recovery groups forming, and they'll be formalized to respond to the wildfires?
Thanks, Vice Chair. So the legislation as it stands today require that if you're in a city, the lead agency must be the city. And if you're in an unincorporated county jurisdiction, it must be the county. That's what the law states. In practice, when we've seen things like in unincorporated Riverside County, while the jurisdiction may be the name and they are required to sort of pull the trigger with the administrative actions, the sort of coalition building and the visioning and kind of the putting together the business plan beforehand can come from other stakeholders. We're kind of seeing it play out a little bit in Palisades as an example, local community groups, but also private sector groups trying to figure out the ingredients for what we feel will ultimately result in one of these districts. So, but ultimately the trigger needs to be pulled at the city level first, and then the other folks follow.
Okay, and then this was touched on a bit, but technical assistance. What happens when a community can't afford a COSMOD to help them move forward with a CRD?
I mean, I think that is one of the questions. We don't have a specific answer just yet, but one of the reasons why we're working to stand up this incubator is that we want to make sure that communities that, may not have the resources can be able to stand this up. In terms of kind of where that funding comes from, we are looking and pursuing a number of different options here. But that is one thing that I think also SCAG is interested.
Sure. Sarah Jepson, I'm the Chief Planning Officer here at SCAG. I think one of the issues that we have recognized throughout all of our planning work and our work on regional plans is that local governments often do not have the capacity to do the initial planning work to support these types of activities moving forward. That's why we've been so active working with all of you to get the state to give us more resources like our REAP 1 and REAP 2 program, where we can help locals who don't have this capacity otherwise to do the types of studies and research in order to be able to move these things forward. So for an example, as Joe had mentioned, through the REAP 1 and 2 program, we then set up kind of a call for projects, our competitive program for our local agencies. And your local jurisdictions applied, and we had several who wanted to do enhanced infrastructure financing districts. So then we funded through our state dollars a study that could serve multiple cities at the same time and let them go through this analysis and help them move forward if they wanted. So I do think organizations like SCAG, and this is certainly one of the things that we're exploring as we're thinking about what's our role in resilience, is where are those places that we as a regional planning agency can be working to bring the resources from other places so we can help build that local capacity.
I was hoping you would say that, Sarah. And then my final question is just, you brought up reducing risks versus mitigation. And I just wonder, does one have more sway over the ability to get grants than the other?
That's an interesting question. I don't know that I have really thought about that in those terms. I think from my view, at this moment, I would say no, but I think that's partly because from a kind of a funding perspective, I think our kind of how we've approached funding climate adaptation and resilience and risk reduction is not quite as mature as in some other areas, especially, for example, on the emissions reduction side. So I think broadly in terms of, and I should say, like, I spent a number of years working at the state and working on our climate budget and climate resilience budget. So I'm kind of this is also on me, but I think we're really trying to figure out how do we move from kind of a one-time grant funding opportunity that maybe is a little bit ad hoc as we're trying to figure out how to really manage climate risk to a more structured view. And, from my view at this moment, I think strategically investing in the risk reduction needs to be core to where sustained funding is going, because the other pieces, which are critical, we're not going to be manageable to try to just mitigate against a risk if the risk is continuing to increase. So
thank you. Thank you.
Would it be okay if I added something? Sorry about that. So when we're a lot of our work, grants are a key component of a multi-component strategy. And we look at it the same way, like for my own home, I'm going to prioritize the cheaper stuff with the bigger impact, the lower hanging fruit, vents on my roof, to block embers from coming in. We oftentimes encourage the same approach when looking at grant sources. Grant providers have limited funding. They probably want to extend their impact as much as possible to generate as much benefit, also claim as many victories as possible. So to the extent priorities could be placed on the lower cost, higher impact solutions, that's just a strategic angle we often look at when asking a grant source with an application. Maybe your ask is more targeted, more focused than other applications would be. That's just a perspective we would suggest.
Well, we're technically at time. And so maybe this is something that I can plant the seed. And if there's things you think of, you could send it along to have it passed along to everyone else. But part of what I've been wondering is and there were some things that were hinted at, but if there are policy changes, whether related to the districts or resilience and mitigation in general, that SCAG could help with, or that our jurisdictions could help with, if there's anything that you all could think of. I think that could be helpful, but we are at time. So if there's anything specific you all think of, maybe you could pass that along.
So key. I'm working with the finance committee with City of LA, and there's a bunch of us trying to figure out the insurance and the mortgage issues, in addition to bringing the climate resilience district. One thing that Cosmon has been toying with is when we create these districts, it would help the homeowners if we allocated the tax increment, a portion of it, to a reserve fund, which would help the insurance companies underwrite the risk in the area. And we've never had a chance, and this is, we want to work with Nuantara to advance this dialogue, because it's all about how the insurance companies underwrite the risk. And the FAIR Plan puts a big burden on them because they're reserving against catastrophic risk. So maybe these CRDs can be done so a portion of the increment helps solve local risk, which helps the homeowner get a homeowner policy at a more reasonable and consistent cost. Just a thought. And I think SCAG should be aware of that as we all move forward on this initiative. It'd be a great help.
Thank you. And please keep us in the loop in the conversation. I'm sure you're talking with staff. But thank you very much for your presentations. With that, I will move to my chair's report. I want to welcome our new members. We have Brian Josh from Chino Hills from SBCTA. We have Debbie Baker, City of La Palma, RC District 18. Jesus Escobar, Imperial County. Yasmin Imani McMorrin from Culver City, West Side Cities COG, and Patty Senecal from the city of Seal Beach, OCC OG. So thank you all. Welcome to our committee. And then in the interest of time, I will keep my comment short. You guys had a good primer to what I experienced last week. I spent 2 days on the Climate Resilience Summit. So I heard some of this information last week from some of the people who spoke today. So that gives you all a good sense of the conversation. But one thing that we didn't talk about today that I want to touch on is just the idea of like thinking about where our entities are in the planning process. Like the reality is we've probably all been impacted by flooding, fires, extreme heat, something. And if not personally, it's probably a matter of time until we are. And certainly we all have known people that have been impacted, if not people within our families and community. And so really thinking about how we all work together, across the divisions that in other places, get in the way of having these conversations. Like, how do we all work together? How do we find common goals and common language so that we can really address the problems that are impacting our communities in real ways? And so that was one of the pieces of things that they talked about. And then really sort of thinking about like, where is your community at? And what would it look like to move to the next step? They had a nice little circle. I don't have that circle to share with you right this second. But like, is your community not even started in having this conversation? Are you just now starting to think about, oh, we have a problem, we should do something about it? You know, are you already making plans? And every community is in a different place, but really kind of thinking about like, where is your own community in having this conversation or not? And working for planning for the things that we can do, like they talked about this morning. You know, how can we mitigate the risks? And how can we be better prepared for not if, but when things happen in our communities? So lots more conversation. We started the conversation at our last meeting. We had more of it today. We'll continue to have these conversations, but just we want to make sure that we get to a point where we don't go, oh, it's too overwhelming, we do nothing. Because we can't really afford to do nothing at this point. And I think that that's becoming more and more clear. So how do we all work together across sectors, public and private? You know, we all have an interest in making sure that we're better prepared. So we will keep the conversation going, and grateful for the conversations this morning around financing options. And we'll look forward to more policy discussion. And then Rachel, are you giving our staff report this morning? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I just have a few announcements for us. I wanted to highlight our SCAG scholarship program. Applications are currently being received. This is a wonderful program that we do each year in partnership with the California Transportation Foundation to award 9 scholarships worth $4,000 each to high school seniors and 2-year community college students in the SCAG region. The applications will close on March 21st, so we appreciate you promoting and sharing with everyone in your communities who might benefit. Secondly, I just wanted to give a heads up. You all should have probably received an email from our clerk of the board. Next month at the April meeting, we are going to be holding elections for EEC chair and vice chair. So if you're interested in nominating someone or yourself, you can reply to our clerk of the board, Maggie, with the name of the individual no later than 5 p.m. on Wednesday, March 26th. And you can also nominate from the floor during that meeting. The term for the office is going to commence upon the adjournment of the General Assembly business meeting on May 1st. And speaking of the General Assembly, as you know, the annual Regional Conference and General Assembly is going to be held in Palm Desert, May 1st through 2nd, and we look forward to seeing everyone there. That concludes my updates. Thanks.
Thank you. And do we have any member announcements this morning? Seeing none. Are there any online? Okay. With that, we will adjourn. Thank you all for your participation. And we will look forward to seeing you on April 3rd. Thank you.
Thank you. You're beautiful. And I